successful father.
My dad is a very driven alpha male, and that's what I was looking for when I was looking for a partner.
Then Paul Carter roars into her life with style.
Paul showed up in a bright yellow sports car. He was very sexual and very driven, and I appealed to him. That made me feel great.
But soon, the thrill ride gets out of control.
We gave him the moniker the Casanova con man because his biggest cons were of women.
He's an opportunist and he's a scoundrel.
All these revelations are coming out from people who he has ripped off.
This is where things took a dangerous turn, and he made a threat against her life.
You can't get away from a predator.
And Brooklyn's ride into the sunset comes crashing down around her.
I went out and bought myself a rifle. I was terrified of what might happen. I grew up in Australia, in a fairly rural area, on a cow farm. My favourite memories of being on the farm was spending time with my father on Saturday mornings. I had two younger brothers who were both asthmatics, so they didn't spend time out on the farm, which made spending time with my dad more special to me. That was the only one-on-one time that I got to spend with him.
Andrew Facey, Brooklyn's father, is a wealthy fourth-generation real estate developer in Melbourne.
When I was a kid, I thought my dad was a superhero. He took over his father's real estate business when he was 18 years old, and he expanded the business very significantly.
Brooklyn's mother is a beautiful socialite.
I had a very difficult relationship with my mother. There was the expectation that I was going to be as thin and as beautiful as what she was. And it didn't seem to matter what I did. It was never good enough for her. And it's caused a significant amount of trauma in my life.
Brooklyn wants to follow in her father's footsteps one day, but here too, she meets with rejection.
My intention was to take over the family business, but my father is somewhat old school in that he likes to keep the men in the business and the women at home.
Her dad does agree to support her financially, and Brooklyn sets her sights on college. But then, disaster strikes.
When I was 18 years old, I had a head-on collision with a truck. I had a closed head injury, my face and jaw was smashed, and I have since had 54 orthopedic surgeries to rebuild my body. I spent most of the year either in a wheelchair or on crutches, but I managed to get through that year at college.
Brooklyn eventually finishes her degree, but rethinks her future.
I couldn't spend time standing and on my feet all day, which is what's required if you're in real estate. One of the things that interested me was esthetician. So I did a course in that, and then I opened my own business in a gym in Melbourne. I met my first husband at the gym after one of the surgeries. After my car accident, I felt like I had been smashed into pieces, and I felt that nobody was going to want me. So as soon as somebody did come along that appeared interested in me, I feel like I kind of latched on to that.
The couple marry in 1996 when Brooklyn is 27, and she gives birth to her first son a year later.
By the time I was pregnant with my second son, I was working and I had a toddler, and my patience with my husband was really just running low. I said to him, "You're going to have to go because you're not pulling your weight."
After 5 years of marriage, Brooklyn takes full custody of her sons with minimal resistance from her ex. A year later, she's ready to dip her toes back into the dating pool.
For anyone who's been a single mother, it's an exhausting gig. And I hoped that I would find someone who would come in and be a part of the family and contribute to that. So I signed up for an Australian dating online service.
She met Paul Carter on RSVP, the online dating site. He came across to her as very available. He was single, unmarried, without children, and looking for love.
So the next night I went on my first date with Paul Carter. And that was a date with destiny, to say the least. Paul showed up in a bright yellow sports car, and that epitomised Paul's personality. He was flashy, he was showy. We went out for dinner and we laughed and talked and got on great, and he was just very easy to talk to, and we just kind of clicked. He has a big personality and he is an amusing person to spend time with.
Paul is ambitious and has his sights set on a bright financial future as a real estate developer and independent business owner.
I needed a man that was going to step up, somebody that had the sort of alpha male qualities that my dad had. That's how Paul came across initially. We got romantically involved pretty quickly from that point. I had come from being married to somebody who was really not physically interested in me at all. And he was this guy, he was very sexual and a great lover. And I appealed to him. That made me feel great.
Eventually, Brooklyn introduces her sons to Paul.
My middle son was about 18 months old and my eldest son was about 4. And he got along great with them and he was happy to play with them and spend time with them, and so they thought he was great.
For 6 months, the four are spending all of their weekend time together. Eventually, work intervenes and Paul says he has to focus on some business matters.
He says that he can't see me this weekend. Okay, that's fine, no problem. I thought it was because he was trying to get stuff done. I ended up going to the South Melbourne market, and I'm wandering around the market and I look up and here's Paul walking towards me hand in hand with a girl that I had no idea who she was. And he couldn't get her to let go of his hand fast enough. And I said to him, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just showing so-and-so around Melbourne. She's here visiting from Canada." And I couldn't even think at that point. Like, I couldn't think of anything to say. I was left standing there like an idiot, in shock. And when I finally got to ask him about it, his explanation was, "Oh, I was holding her hand because she was scared." She was scared. He claims that she just showed up unannounced. Nobody flies from Canada to Australia on a whim. I'm not somebody that strings people out or plays games, so I wasn't at that time familiar with being played the way that he was playing me. I started to get suspicious. I couldn't understand why I was never invited to his place. So one day when he was in the shower, I pulled his driver's license from his wallet and got his address. His name on his driver's license was Paul Carter, but the address didn't really fit with the narrative that he was putting up about being this super successful guy and having all these designer brands and this flashy car. And I thought, okay, well, I'll go pay a visit and see what's going on at this house. I pull up to the house and I knocked on the door, and this older man, Paul's dad, answered the door. And I said, "Is Paul Carter here?" And he said, "Do you mean Paul Cristallo?" And I said, "No, Paul Carter. This is his address." He said, "Well, Paul Cristallo lives here with his wife, Sonia, and he has 3 kids from his previous marriage." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was surreal. I have 2 little boys who are becoming quite attached to him. And there was a sideboard just inside the door and it had all these photos from their wedding, the pictures of the kids, pictures of his wife. And I felt like the ground was going to open up and swallow me.
Brooklyn Facey is reeling from the news that her new boyfriend, Paul Carter, is not the successful single man he claims to be. In fact, he's married with kids.
This was his second marriage that he was in. At that point, the first marriage, he had 3 kids. And he has a different last name. At this point, I'm starting to wonder if anything about him is real.
Brooklyn decides to confront Paul, who simply shrugs it off.
He says, yes, I'm married, but we're separated and we're just living in the house together. It didn't sound unrealistic. I thought, this guy's got a lot of potential. He was an exciting person. He's not boring like my last husband was. In hindsight, I should have just stuck with boring.
After the painful confrontation, Paul divorces his second wife and moves into an apartment. And soon, the deception is in the rear view as he plays dad to a blended family with Brooklyn.
He had 3 young children. I had 2 young children. Their ages sort of meshed together. Every other weekend, we had all 5 of them. I loved having the kids there. It was a lot of work for sure, but my boys were happy to have playmates. Thought Paul was pretty good with helping with things around the house, and he was involved in everything that they were doing. So we had a pretty good team situation going on. It meant a great deal to me because I was looking for a partner.
In March 2003, 8 months after first meeting Paul, he surprises Brooklyn with a grand gesture.
Paul proposed to me at the beach. He got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. I was thrilled. I was so excited. He convinced me that the life that we were going to have together was going to be wonderful. I didn't really get a sense that my parents didn't like him until I said to them that we were getting married, and they were not in favour of the idea. Right from the get-go, my father thought Paul was sketchy and he couldn't put his finger on it. But, you know, I was an adult. I was in my 30s by that stage, and I was going to do what I was going to do. So we got married on St Kilda Beach in Melbourne. My father came to the wedding. My mother did not come to the wedding. We had all the kids there, all dressed up in black pants and white shirts, and it was so beautiful. And everything seemed so perfect that day. I finally felt like I had the family that I had not had for my whole life. And I was the mother in the family, and I was never going to let my kids feel lonely or sad or unloved. Just thought that was the beginning of the happily ever after. So after we got married, the first couple of years were kind of rough. I was dealing with chronic pain from my car accident, but I felt like Paul had my back. I felt like he was there for me. For the most part, he seemed to be on my team.
The couple doesn't have to worry about money. Brooklyn may be cut out of running the family business, but her dad is still supportive. They move into a bigger house, and when she starts feeling healthier, they take another big step.
We decided to have a child together, and we had Mac, who is the love of my life, and he is my heart and soul.
After Mac's birth, Brooklyn and Paul buy an outdoor equipment company to run as a family business.
I was hoping that it would be something that we could work together in, and then there would be like a legacy for our kids. I was working there part-time, and I was doing the books, and Paul was selling the items, and he was very creative with his marketing, and he would start selling things on eBay. My dad injected a very significant amount of money so we could try and, make a go of it. He was trying to protect me financially, and he wanted to help Paul create something that was going to be good for us.
But after 18 months, they don't have enough cash flow to replenish their stock.
Paul was spending more money than he was bringing in. It wasn't until he was working for something that I was involved in that I got a glimpse of his poor business practices. And my dad basically bailed us out of it. So once we lost the company, my dad then had that over me. And I was going to hear about that forever and a day, that he had saved me and that otherwise we would have been bankrupt. Paul really did a good job of putting a wedge between us.
In 2010, Paul was appointed the CEO of United Housing Victoria, which is a publicly funded community housing company, and there he ran big sort of multi-million-dollar construction jobs.
The organization provides housing for low-income families.
He manages to pull this great job with United Housing, a very secure job, paying very well, and I'm thinking, great, everything's back on track now. I had no idea that he was doing anything wrong at the time.
He was let go after 2 years because they saw they were just hemorrhaging money. The suspicion was that Paul was blowing out the contracts of these construction jobs and pocketing that money.
Brooklyn and Paul have huge mortgage payments for the house they own together, and their debts are mounting because of Paul's excessive spending.
I was panic-stricken, and Paul's way of placating me was to say, I'll just pick up extra jobs on the side. We were in a bad place in our marriage. We ended up having to sell the house. My dad was furious. He was telling me that Paul doesn't know what he's doing. I was humiliated, totally humiliated. The fact that Paul was so irresponsible with money was another reason that my dad felt that he was not a good influence on the boys and that they would be better off with their biological father. He was putting pressure on my ex-husband. My father said to him, I will pay for your lawyers and I will put the kids through school. They took me to court and they filed for custody of my sons.
The custody battle continues for 3 years.
I had run out of money for lawyers. I had no chance of winning. No chance.
Finally, in 2013, Brooklyn loses custody of her 2 oldest sons, who are now 12 and 15. Perhaps influenced by their grandfather, they choose to side with their father.
So my ex-husband, he allowed my father to do this, and he really hasn't worked a day since then. There's only one thing that I really take pride in, and that is that I think I'm a good mum. And for me to lose my kids like that was just so devastating. If it wasn't for Mac, it would have been the end of me.
But for Brooklyn, these losses are just the beginning. Brooklyn Carter is staggering from the heartbreaking loss of her custody battle.
My family, I have no connection with because they've all taken my dad's side. I've lost 2 of my sons, so all I have left is my youngest son and my husband. It would have been easier for me if I had died that day. Everything that I had tried to keep safe and everything that mattered to me had just been handed over to someone else. And I just hope that when my boys are older, they realise that I never, ever stopped loving them. For a long time, I was so focused on the court battle with my kids that I was not paying attention to my husband. He felt that he was missing out on time and energy that I should have been putting into him. He was going to motocross meetings and joining motocross clubs. He was buying cars and changing cars frequently.
Paul would use Brooklyn to subsidise his lifestyle, things like fast cars, properties, credit cards.
There was constant stress in the house. Bills needed to be paid.
Brooklyn has managed to protect a portion of her nest egg from Paul's spending, but she's concerned he might eventually drain all of her money.
I really didn't have a lot of options other than to take back control myself. And my version of that was to take my money and put it somewhere else where Paul couldn't touch it, and I knew it would be safe. So we got an E2 treaty visa, which is granted to Australians who invest into a business in the United States. We had been to Boston to visit, and I loved it there. So I bought a couple of houses and rented them out.
Coincidentally, just as Brooklyn ties up her finances with offshore real estate and her money is out of his reach, Paul comes into a windfall.
On my son Mac's 5th birthday, we were having a party at our house for him, and Paul announced to me that he had inherited a large plot of land from his grandmother, and the government were trying to buy that land because they wanted to put a highway through.
Paul explains that this land is in Italy, and the sale is slightly delayed by red tape.
He showed me some documentation, and it all looked very bona fide to me, which was incredibly exciting because he was telling me that it was worth tens of millions of dollars. And that's one of the things about Paul. He always bounces back, often bigger and better than he was before.
Brooklyn feels hope for the first time since losing custody of her oldest sons. But she's worried how their absence is affecting Mac, her youngest.
It was very difficult for my youngest son to come home every night and not have his brothers there and go to the same school and not see his brothers.
Brooklyn suggests to Paul that they move to Boston.
By this stage, he was working for himself as a builder, and he had various projects underway. He said, okay, great, we'll buy houses, renovate them and flip them and start a new life.
Brooklyn and Mac head to Boston in April of 2014.
I was still devastated about my sons, but it was easier to try and move forward when I wasn't faced with the same things every day that reminded me of them. So Mac and I are in Boston. He was happy, I was happy, and we were expecting that Paul would join us within 2, maybe 3 months. Then suddenly the communication starts to dwindle and he's not calling every day. He didn't contact me for my birthday. It didn't take long for me to question him about what was going on. So he says to me, I would finish these jobs a lot quicker if you can fund them, and then once I finish them, I'll get the final payment and then I'll repay you.
Brooklyn knows that lending money to Paul is a risk, but after 11 years of marriage, she doesn't want to give up on him.
I don't like quitters, and I don't like to quit on things myself. I'm going to stick with something until the very end. So I went ahead and gave him the money.
It won't be long before Brooklyn discovers the real purpose of the money.
It was the middle of the night, and I was woken up by Mac, who was then 8 years old, who had his iPad in his hand. So he hands me his iPad and says, Who is this lady in the picture with Dad? Somebody had sent him a Facebook notification. Hang on, is this an old picture of Paul? This is my husband, but I've got no idea who this woman is. Paul's wearing a black tie suit, and this blonde woman is wearing what looks like a ball gown. I had no idea when the photo was taken, who this woman was, what Paul was doing there, or what the event was. I felt sick. I felt like my whole life was spinning out of control.
Brooklyn Carter is mortified to discover pictures of her husband in the very close company of another woman.
I'm realizing that this is not an old photo from some time before my time with Paul. This is something that's going on now that shouldn't be going on.
It doesn't take long to figure out that the event is an engagement party, and the lady in red is Paul's new fiancée.
Catherine Dubois was a Melbourne woman. She was a bit of a socialite, had great friends, but love was missing, and so she went online to find that. Catherine met Paul on Tinder. Paul rocked up to that date driving a Maserati and claimed he owned a big fleet of them. He claimed to be a self-made millionaire with this big property empire across Melbourne and Queensland.
The courtship begins after Brooklyn leaves for Boston.
Catherine said it was something of a whirlwind romance. He was extremely kind, he paid a lot of attention to her, and came across as extremely committed. She decided to move in with him, and to her shock, he lived in this basic townhouse in Box Hill, which is certainly not where you'd think a multimillionaire lives. Paul had an explanation, and that was that this was a temporary place that he was living while he and his ex-partner had been building this dream home. He actually told her his ex-wife had passed away with brain cancer, so she stopped asking questions. It was about 12 weeks into their love story. Paul got down on one knee and asked Catherine to marry him, and it was an easy yes for her. Catherine owned a beauty bar just outside of Melbourne, and it was to be acquired by the government to make way for a major road project. Catherine said that Paul really convinced her that he was something of an acquisitions expert, and so she was quick to transfer him power of attorney.
With Brooklyn conveniently tucked away in Boston, Paul Carter feels confident that he's safe to openly celebrate his new love. But he fails to consider the massive reach of social media.
After several months of me questioning whether he was having an affair or he was becoming more and more distant, I finally had the proof. So I called him and I said to him, "What the hell is this? What is going on?" He said that he would come over to Boston, and in the meantime we were doing counselling over the phone and trying to figure out if this was at all salvageable.
In Australia, Catherine Dubois receives a very similar shock.
After Catherine and Paul's engagement party, she receives a call from somebody who knows Paul. And they tell her, he has a wife and child in the US. You need to end this. Catherine now believes that he was trying to take over the beauty salon that she'd transferred into his name.
Paul and Catherine break off their relationship, and in November 2014, Paul heads off to Boston and attempts to patch up his relationship with Brooklyn.
He was able to convince me that he was remorseful for what he had done. I'd already been through a divorce and lost my kids. I wasn't going to risk doing that again and losing my youngest son. So I was going to do whatever I had to do to make it work. I still felt like I could pull out the defibrillator once again and restart the heart and try and get things back on track.
On a romantic trip to New York City for Brooklyn's 46th birthday, Paul tells her he wants to renew his commitment to her.
We had a lovely weekend in New York City, and he had organised with a jeweller to look at some diamonds because he was going to get a ring made for me.
But within weeks, it becomes clear she'll never get that diamond ring.
The money hasn't been transferred to the jeweller. No money has come into our accounts. I had faced about as much humiliation as I could take at this point. I was really losing faith in Paul. But I want to be able to say to my kids that I gave it my best shot. I didn't just quit because it got too hard. I just wasn't prepared to lose all that money and then find out a couple of weeks later that he inherited tens of millions of dollars from his grandmother.
Paul has one more gambit to keep Brooklyn happy.
Early 2018, we took over a lease on a horse farm that we were to purchase. We had scheduled the closing to coincide with plenty of time for the money to come from overseas.
Paul spent many years convincing Brooklyn that he was to inherit, and every time this deal was due to close, there was always an excuse as to why it wasn't happening. He would go to extreme lengths to keep up the con. Fake contracts written in Italian would be delivered to her door, and another time that she'd receive calls from a fake number explaining to her why this was being delayed.
With the final payment on the farm looming, Brooklyn puts pressure on Paul for some financial relief. And this turns into his breaking point.
Paul came home and said, "There's no inheritance. There isn't any money coming. There's no money." I slid down the fridge and onto the floor like a cartoon character. The whole game was up.
Furious and deeply betrayed, Brooklyn kicks Paul out.
I was now left with this farm that I had to pay for. I enlisted the support of my dad to help figure out the financial part of it until I was able to sell my house and repay him. Fortunately for me, my father made me sign a prenup with Paul, so I didn't end up having to split our assets. Finally, I had control of my life back again from Paul Carter. Or so I thought.
Paul, cut off from his slush fund, is angry and desperate.
Paul shows up to the farm. He was really angry. And he says to me, "I'm going to kill myself, but I'm going to make sure I take you down with me." And I just felt chills go down my spine.
Brooklyn Carter is finally coming clean with herself about who her husband really is, and she's terrified.
He was not in control of money, property, our child, nothing. The gravy train had well and truly stopped, and it just enraged him. I went out and bought myself a rifle. My son was sleeping with a baseball bat next to his bed. I was terrified of what might happen.
Brooklyn gets a restraining order, and then finally, after 16 years of marriage, she files for divorce.
I couldn't lose any more money. I couldn't lose any more sleep. I couldn't be any more miserable. I thought, if I don't do something now, I'm not even going to have the energy to get out of this marriage.
In August 2019, the divorce becomes final, and Brooklyn gets full custody of Mac.
I couldn't hold back my emotion, and I burst into tears, and my head fell onto the desk in the courtroom.
But there is just one problem.
I became increasingly concerned about being on the same visa as Paul Carter. I decided I needed to get Mac and I a new visa. My very close friend suggested that we get married because we both had no intentions of ever remarrying in our lives.
Brooklyn and her female friend hold a garden wedding in Albany in September 2019.
She was going to come and live at the house that I had built at my farm, and we were just going to grow old together and help each other out and be companions for each other.
Before the couple can even move in together, Brooklyn's life takes an unforeseen turn.
I get a call from 60 Minutes Australia.
He may look like an ordinary bloke, but this is one of Australia's most cunning con men, a ruthless operator who's fleeced millions from family, friends, the rich and the poor.
60 Minutes seemed to have even more information about things that he had done that I had no clue about.
We gave him the moniker the Casanova con man because his biggest cons were of women he made believe that he loved them.
Paul Carter.
They tracked him down at a job site, which was a very rewarding moment to see because they made him come down off the roof and it was just perfect.
Why would you tell Catherine that your partner had died of bone
Yeah, that was
cancer?
a mistake. I was going through a bad time with my then wife and it was just a mistake.
They knew about the Uniting Church fiasco and they just had facts and figures and numbers on different projects that he was doing. He hadn't had time to prepare any answers, but he still denied everything.
So I keep hearing this, but I don't know who you're talking about.
He's just deny, 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 deny.
What about the Italian inheritance that didn't exist?
There isn't one.
Was that another mistake?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
After the expose, Paul Carter becomes the subject of a Homeland Security investigation.
He had engaged in these fraud schemes for many years with almost no law enforcement intervention. We were able to determine that he had used multiple identities. At that time, his most recent name is Paul Hamilton. We execute a search warrant at his residence. We found a law diploma under the name of Paul Hamilton. We found a document that was fraudulent from the Department of Homeland Security indicating that he had been awarded United States citizenship. We found military uniforms in his closet. We found a document indicating that he was the beneficiary of over $30 million in trust funds. All of these items were in line with what the underlying allegations were about him. We immediately arrested Paul Carter. So we took him into custody on the felony charges of visa fraud and false statements.
This should have been the end of Brooklyn's nightmare with Paul, except that her marriage to him has put her under the microscope of Homeland Security as well.
A couple of months later, it was about 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and there's a knock on the door. Brooklyn, we need you to open the door. It's Homeland Security.
The execution of the search warrant at Brooklyn's house was specifically in regard to the allegations of marriage fraud against her.
They're bashing on the door. Open the door, Brooklyn. So I opened the door and 8 agents in bulletproof vests with guns stormed through my door and up the stairs. They took all our cell phones and computers, took my son's gaming computer, everything that they could get their hands on, and sent it to Quantico to get analysed.
Brooklyn is suspected of committing marriage fraud with her wife in order to gain a green card.
I was not prepared to drag her or her family through the mud with the government. This was supposed to be a happy situation for both of us.
Brooklyn divorces her wife in June 2020.
They never charged me with marriage fraud, but it was enough for them to then look at the ESTA form that I'd filled in and decide, oh, well, that's not right either. There was a felony charge for filling in the ESTA while I was still in the United States.
Brooklyn Carter ultimately pled guilty to making false statements on the ESTA application, which is utilized to re-enter the United States at some point.
Paul Carter also faces his day of reckoning in a federal court, and despite the many allegations, he too is charged with visa fraud on April 7, 2021, and held in an Albany jail.
Paul Carter was sentenced to time served and a $5,000 fine. We were not, as an agency, pleased with the sentence, but he's now a convicted felon, which in part is based on the work that our agency and our office did.
His deportation hearing has been delayed, and now he has moved to the other side of the country and applied for a green card. So it seems that he's bought himself another couple of years of stalling techniques.
I think based on his history, it's likely that he'll come back around. I'd be surprised if we haven't heard the last of Paul Carter.
Meanwhile, because of Brooklyn's conviction, she must leave the United States. A huge disappointment, but there is a silver lining. A man named Sean Donahue.
I heard that she had to leave the country, and I said, I'm going to marry you, and I'm going to get your son away from Paul. And if he'll have me and you'll allow it, I'm going to adopt him and make him a Donahue.
I can't overstate how wonderful he has been to Mac and I. He's the happy ending that we deserve. I've brought chaos to this man's life and he's still there standing right beside me. And I believe he will be till our dying days.
We're happy as can be now. We are not going to let anybody shatter our marriage. And I'll be with Brooklyn as soon as I can in another country at the soonest available time.
I've been dragged through the gates of hell to get to the happy ending. I've come out the other end. It's going to make a good story for my grandchildren, that's for sure.
It begins with a sound no one remembers hearing, because at the time it meant nothing. A late summer breeze brushing through palm leaves, a screen door slapping once and falling silent, a Florida night in 1995, warm and indifferent as always, the kind of night that absorbs secrets without leaving fingerprints, and somewhere inside that darkness a life slips quietly out of alignment, unnoticed, unrecorded, unprotected, until years later, when the word cold case will be spoken like a verdict, heavy, final, and too late. She was 27, not famous, not wealthy, not reckless enough to make headlines, the kind of person who occupies the background of other people's memories, a dental assistant according to one record, a bartender according to another, always punctual, always polite, always expected to show up the next morning, and when she doesn't, the absence registers not as alarm but as confusion, a phone left ringing, a shift uncovered, a car still parked exactly where it should be. Keys gone, purse missing, door unlocked, no sign of struggle, no blood, no broken glass, just a quiet apartment that feels wrong in a way no photograph can capture. The first officer on scene notes the temperature, the humidity, the smell of old coffee in the sink, a half-folded load of laundry, a television turned off at the wall, the calendar on the fridge circled around a date that never arrives, and he writes it all down because that's what you do when nothing makes sense. You document the ordinary in the hope that it will later become extraordinary, but it doesn't. Not yet. And the report closes with a phrase that will be repeated for decades. No. Immediate signs of foul play. The neighborhood doesn't panic. It murmurs, whispers passing between mailboxes and driveways, because this is Florida in the mid-90s. Because people vanish for reasons that don't involve violence, because it's easier to believe in choice than in danger, and the early theories bloom and die quickly. A boyfriend maybe, an argument, a sudden trip, a breakdown, someone mentions drugs, someone else mentions starting over, and with each passing day the possibility of urgency thins. The search radius shrinks, the posters curl at the edges under the sun. Detectives arrive with coffee-stained notebooks and cautious voices. They walk the apartment again, slower this time, checking behind doors that have already been checked, opening drawers that hold nothing but socks and receipts. They bag a hairbrush, a cigarette but from the ashtray though she wasn't a smoker, a glass with a faint lipstick mark, and they ask the neighbors the same questions twice, then 3 times, because stories shift when repeated. But these don't. Everyone saw nothing, heard nothing, remembers nothing useful, and the case begins to feel like it's resisting them, like a body refusing to float. Her car becomes a focal point, a compact sedan parked under a flickering streetlight, dust gathering on the windshield, a parking ticket accumulating fines, the inside clean, no signs of a struggle, no fingerprints that don't belong, no clue hiding in the trunk, and when AK-9 circles it and loses interest, the silence deepens, the kind that suggests not chaos but planning, not panic but patience. And that thought unsettles even the most experienced investigator, because it implies intent. Without evidence, a predator without teeth marks. Days stretch into weeks, weeks into months. The case file thickens with paper but not with answers. Leads arrive late at night and evaporate by morning, A woman seen at a bus station who isn't her, a credit card charge that turns out to be a clerical error, a call from another state that leads nowhere, and slowly the tone of the investigation shifts from pursuit to maintenance, the calls less frequent, the searches less urgent, until one day the file is moved to a different shelf, a colder one. And no one announces it, but everyone knows what it means. Her family refuses to accept the downgrade. They call, they write, they show up unannounced, they bring photographs to the station, smiling photographs, holiday photographs, proof of existence offered like evidence, and the detectives listen with practiced sympathy. Because they've seen this before, they know how hope hardens into ritual, how grief can survive indefinitely when fed by uncertainty. And they promise to keep looking even as the case slips further behind newer crimes with louder victims and clearer villains. The community moves on because communities always do. Houses change owners. The streetlight that once flickered is replaced. The apartment is rented again, painted a different color, the quiet wrongness scrubbed away by fresh carpet and time. But the name remains in police databases, in microfilm, in the memory of a single retired officer who still can't explain why it bothered him more than the others, why it felt incomplete in a way that paperwork couldn't fix. Years pass, technology evolves, DNA becomes a word spoken with reverence, databases expand, old evidence is relogged, retested, reimagined, and still this case resists because there is no body, no crime scene, no confirmed crime. Only an absence that the law struggles to prosecute, and so the file gathers dust again. The label Florida 1995 cold case now a shorthand for failure, for limits, for questions no longer asked out loud. Then, without warning, something shifts, not at the apartment, not at the station, not even in Florida, but on a highway miles away, years later, during a stop so ordinary it barely registers in the memory of the officer who initiates it, flashing lights, a pulled-over vehicle, a routine request for license and registration, the kind of interaction that happens thousands of times a day. And yet buried in that moment is a connection waiting decades to surface, a thread that will tug gently at first, then violently, unraveling assumptions, reopening wounds, and dragging the past back into the light whether anyone is ready or not. Because cold cases don't stay cold forever. They wait, they hibernate, they survive on fragments and chance, and sometimes all it takes is a single interruption, a name typed into the wrong box, a face that doesn't quite match the paperwork, a detail that refuses to align, and suddenly the silence that protected the mystery begins to crack, softly at first, then louder, until the sound becomes impossible to ignore. And Florida 1995 is no longer just a date on a file, but a presence again, breathing, accusing, and very much alive. The traffic stop happens under fluorescent highway lights that bleach everything into the same tired color, a stretch of road that exists only to be passed through, not remembered, and the officer doesn't sense history pressing in as he approaches the driver's side window. He smells fast food and stale air, hears the click of the engine cooling, sees hands on the steering wheel just a fraction too stiff. A man in his early 40s with a face that doesn't argue, but doesn't relax either. The kind of face officers see every night and forget by morning. Except tonight nothing aligns cleanly. The license is valid, but the name hesitates on the officer's tongue. The birth date feels wrong. Not incorrect, just displaced, like a coat worn in the wrong season. The man says he's in a hurry. Everyone is. The man says he didn't notice the broken taillight. No one ever does. The man answers questions smoothly, too smoothly maybe. The officer can't say why, but the rhythm is off. The pauses come half a second late, as if he's recalling answers instead of producing them, and the officer runs the ID because that's protocol, because curiosity is cheaper than regret. And while the database churns, the highway hums, trucks screaming past, indifferent witnesses, to an interaction that will never make the news, never be remembered as anything other than routine, except the screen flashes and then hesitates, a stutter in the system, a lag that draws the officer's eyes closer. A secondary name appears, not an alias exactly, more like a ghost entry, a partial match, flagged years ago and never cleared, connected to a missing persons record from Florida, mid-90s, unresolved, and the officer feels the smallest tightening in his chest, the instinct that tells you when a thread is worth pulling. even if you don't yet know what it's attached to, and he asks the man to step out of the vehicle, voice steady, polite, rehearsed, because nothing has happened yet, not officially. The man complies, too quickly, movements efficient, practiced, and as they stand by the guardrail, the officer asks a question he didn't plan to ask, a casual probe about previous addresses, about Florida, about where the man was living in 1995, and the air changes, subtly, but enough. The man's jaw tightens, his eyes flicker, a micro-expression gone before it can be accused, but the officer has already seen it, felt it lodge somewhere behind his ribs, and now the conversation is no longer just about a broken taillight. Backup arrives because backup always arrives when intuition raises its hand, and the search that follows is limited and lawful and yields very little. No weapons, no contraband, nothing that would justify escalation, but tucked into the glove compartment is a receipt, old, yellowed, folded too carefully to be trash, from a motel outside Tampa, dated August 1995. The ink faded but legible, and the officer feels the past exhale. The man explains it away with ease, business trip, coincidence, people keep things for strange reasons, and under normal circumstances that explanation would survive. But tonight it collides with a database entry that never expired, a name that never closed, a woman who never came home, and the officer knows he doesn't have enough. Not yet, but he has something better than evidence. He has inconsistency. And he documents everything, the questions, the answers, the pauses, the receipt, the look. That crossed the man's face when Florida was mentioned, and when the stop ends and the vehicle disappears down the highway, the officer doesn't forget the name. He writes it again, slower this time. Weeks pass before the report reaches the right desk, because reports always take time to find their audience, and when it does, it lands in the hands of a detective who has inherited the cold case unit like an old wound, someone who has learned to read between lines written by tired officers decades earlier. And when she sees the year, 1995, Florida, missing woman, her pulse shifts because she's read this file before. Everyone in the unit has. It's the one with no body, no scene, no ending. The one that refuses to become a story with a middle and an end. She pulls the original case file, the paper brittle, the photographs dated by their grain, and she lays the traffic stop report beside it, aligning timelines, names, locations, watching coincidence erode into possibility, because the motel on the receipt sits 3 miles from where the missing woman was last seen, because the man's age matches a witness statement long dismissed as unreliable, because a cigarette brand noted in the original apartment matches the brand sold at the motel vending machine in 1995, details once meaningless now vibrating with potential. The detective doesn't announce a breakthrough. She doesn't allow herself that luxury. She reopens quietly, requests updated searches, asks for DNA comparisons knowing there may be nothing left to compare, recontacts witnesses who have aged out of certainty, whose memories are softer now, less defensive, and she finds something she didn't expect, a neighbor who remembers a car idling late that night. A car he described once and then forgot, a description that matches the vehicle from the traffic stop, same model, same year, same color, common enough to ignore then, precise enough to matter now. The man is contacted again, this time formally, invited to answer questions he technically doesn't have to answer, and he agrees because refusal would feel louder, because decades of silence have taught him confidence, because he believes time has insulated him, and across the table the detective watches him carefully, watches how he sits, how he fills silence, how he reacts when photographs are placed face down between them, photographs he hasn't seen but somehow recognizes, and when she flips one over, the missing woman stares back at him from 1995, smiling, unaware, and for the first time his control fractures, not completely, just enough. He says he knew her casually, says they met once, says he barely remembers, and the detective lets him talk because lies age poorly, because the more detail someone adds, the more surface area they give you to test, and when the interview ends, nothing has been confessed, nothing proven, but the room feels different, heavier, as if it has absorbed something it won't release. Outside, the case stirs, whispers ripple through departments, lab requests are expedited, the words cold case appear again in emails, no longer as an epitaph but as a challenge, and the family is notified cautiously, carefully, because hope can wound as deeply as truth, and they listen in silence, afraid to believe, afraid not to. Evidence that once slept is handled again, re-swabbed, re-scanned, fibers re-examined with tools that didn't exist when the woman vanished, and in the margins of old reports new annotations bloom, question marks replacing periods, and the detective understands something fundamental, that this case was never empty. It was simply waiting for the right interruption, the wrong taillight, the wrong night, the wrong officer to ask the wrong question. But even as momentum builds, uncertainty remains, because no body has emerged, no scene has confessed, and the man's past is clean enough to resist easy condemnation, and so the investigation advances on a knife edge, one discovery away from collapse or clarity, and the pressure mounts quietly, invisibly, as it always does when a story thought finished begins to write itself again, dragging the living and the dead into the same unfinished sentence, where resolution feels close enough to touch, but not yet close enough to claim. The renewed investigation doesn't announce itself with sirens or press conferences. It creeps forward in quiet rooms lit by monitors and desk lamps, where time is measured in keystrokes and patience, and the first thing the detective learns is how fragile old certainty really is, how facts once treated as immovable begin to soften when touched by new light, because memory is not a vault, it's a tide, and 30 years have changed the shoreline. She starts with the witnesses, the ones who were interviewed once and then dismissed, not because they lied but because they didn't know how to be precise. Neighbors who worked night shifts, a convenience store clerk who remembered a woman asking for change, a taxi driver who thought he recognized the photo but couldn't swear to it. And now those people are older, slower, less interested in protecting anyone, their lives quieter, their defenses worn down by time. And when they speak again, details surface that never made it into the original reports: a man waiting in a car, engine running, a voice raised briefly and then lowered, a sense that something wasn't right but didn't feel urgent enough to interrupt the night. One witness remembers the sound, not a scream, not a struggle, just a car door closing hard, harder than necessary, and the detective circles that note in red because it matches the rhythm of the case, abrupt, controlled, final, and she overlays timelines, mapping movements, aligning minutes like pieces of glass, careful not to force them, letting patterns reveal themselves instead of inventing them. The suspect's history is examined next, not for drama but for absence, the spaces where records thin out, where addresses overlap with the missing woman's life in ways that feel uncomfortably intimate. He lived close enough to notice her routines, close enough to learn her habits without being seen, and when co-workers from the 90s are contacted, they describe a man who is reliable, quiet, forgettable, the kind of person no one watches closely, the kind who doesn't stand out even in retrospect, and that quality becomes suspect in itself, because monsters don't announce themselves, they blend. Financial records are pulled, yellowed statements digitized, and a withdrawal from August 1995 catches attention, a cash amount large enough to matter, small enough to explain away, made hours before the woman vanished, and the detective doesn't know yet what it paid for, only that it was never accounted for, never discussed, and now sits like a comma in a sentence that was never finished. The motel receipt from the traffic stop becomes a focal point, traced back through archives, the building long since renovated, the front desk logs half destroyed by hurricanes and neglect, but one page survives, warped but legible, and on it a name appears. Not the suspect's legal name, but one close enough to be intentional, a variation that suggests planning, foresight, and understanding of how records work. And the detective imagines the man standing at the counter 30 years earlier, rehearsing that alias, paying in cash, watching the clerk's pen move across the page, securing anonymity one letter at a time. She returns to the apartment, now a stranger's home, and stands where the woman last stood, measuring distances, imagining movement, noting how close the parking lot sits to the back door, how easily someone familiar could coax someone outside without raising alarms, how Florida heat would discourage resistance, how trust can be weaponized quietly, efficiently, and she understands now why there was no sign of struggle, because struggle requires surprise, and this disappearance feels consensual, right up until it wasn't. Laboratory results begin to trickle in, Not dramatic confirmations, but small shifts. Fibers once deemed irrelevant now matching the upholstery of the suspect's old vehicle, trace elements consistent with the soil near the motel grounds. None of it definitive alone. All of it dangerous together. A constellation forming slowly, patiently, and the detective knows better than to rush it, because cold cases don't forgive haste. They punish assumptions. The suspect is interviewed again, and this time the questions are narrower, sharper, anchored to specifics he didn't know were known, and his answers begin to fray, not collapsing, just thinning, the way fabric does before it tears. He corrects himself unnecessarily, volunteers information unprompted, denies memories too forcefully, and the detective lets the silence do its work. Because silence is pressure without fingerprints. He asks if he's under arrest, a question that arrives too early, and she tells him the truth. Not yet, and he nods as if relieved, but his foot taps under the table, a metronome of anxiety he doesn't realize he's set in motion, and when the interview ends, he leaves behind more than words. He leaves behind a sense of urgency that wasn't there before, a feeling that the clock he trusted is no longer on his side. Outside the station, the family is informed again, this time with more substance, more caution, and they absorb it quietly, because hope has become a language they speak carefully now, and the mother asks the question she's been saving for decades, whether her daughter suffered, and the detective doesn't answer directly, because some answers are still forming and some may never be known. As weeks pass, the investigation tightens, warrants are prepared, old storage units searched, vehicles long sold are traced through ownership chains, and in one of them, hidden beneath years of grime and neglect, something surfaces, not a body, not a weapon, but an object so personal it still hums with presence, a piece of jewelry identified instantly by the family, last seen on the woman the night she vanished. And the air in the evidence room changes, the way it does when theory gives way to fact. The suspect is brought in again, this time with less ceremony, more gravity, and when the object is placed on the table between them, he doesn't look surprised. He looks tired, and that reaction tells the detective everything she needs to know about where this story is headed, even if the law still needs time to catch up. The case, once frozen, now radiates heat, pressure building from every direction, media inquiries beginning to whisper at the edges, prosecutors watching closely, waiting for the moment when probability hardens into proof, and through it all, the absence at the center remains, a woman still missing, still unresolved, her story advancing without her voice, propelled by fragments, by chance, by a routine traffic stop that cracked open a silence the suspect believed would outlive him. And as the investigation edges closer to confrontation, one truth becomes unavoidable, that whatever happened in Florida in 1995 was not an accident of passion or chaos, but an act sustained by time, by anonymity, by the belief that some disappearances are too quiet to matter, a belief that is now, finally, beginning to collapse under its own weight. Pressure changes behavior long before it produces confession, and the detective can feel it now, subtle but constant, like weather moving in, because the suspect's routines begin to fracture under scrutiny. Co-workers report unexplained absences, a sudden request for vacation days he can't quite justify. Neighbors notice lights on at odd hours, a car packed and unpacked more than once. The quiet choreography of someone rehearsing escape without committing to it, and every movement feeds the file. Every deviation becomes another data point in a story that is no longer dormant. The search warrants arrive without ceremony, typed language and legal thresholds translating suspicion into authority, and storage units are opened like time capsules, dust blooming into the air, boxes stacked with the debris of a life lived carefully, nothing overtly criminal, nothing dramatic, just the slow accumulation of normalcy, which is often where the most damaging truths hide, tucked beneath old furniture, sealed in plastic, mislabeled, forgotten, until they aren't. In one unit, a duffel bag surfaces, heavy in a way that suggests intention, and inside it, wrapped in a towel that no longer remembers its original color, are items that don't belong together unless someone made them belong. Gloves from a hardware store that closed in the late 90s, a length of rope cut cleanly at both ends, duct tape still in its original packaging, and none of it illegal on its own. All of it devastating in context, artifacts of preparedness rather than impulse. And the detective feels the narrative narrowing, funneling toward a conclusion that still refuses to name itself out loud. Forensics works quietly, methodically, extracting histories from fibers and adhesives, finding trace DNA too degraded to identify conclusively, but strong enough to exclude coincidence, and the prosecutor watches from a distance, cautious, conservative, because cold cases don't get second chances in court. They either arrive complete or they collapse under their own ambition, and so the threshold remains high, uncomfortably high, even as the weight of implication grows heavier by the day. The suspect's attorney enters the frame, clean suit, controlled tone, the legal equivalent of insulation, and interviews cease immediately, replaced by statements carefully designed to say nothing while sounding cooperative, and the detective doesn't resent it. She expected it, because silence is often the last refuge of people who have run out of credible explanations, and now the case must speak for itself. The media senses movement. Reporters begin to call. Old headlines are pulled from archives and repackaged with speculative language. Phrases like possible break and new suspect identified float through the air, and the family is advised to step back, to protect themselves from hope's volatility. But they watch anyway, because distance feels like betrayal after 30 years of waiting. A break arrives from an unexpected direction, not from a lab or a witness but from accounting, an audit of old evidence logs revealing a box misfiled decades earlier, overlooked not out of malice but out of volume, and inside it, sealed and labeled with fading ink, is the cigarette butt collected from the apartment in 1995, the one deemed insignificant at the time, now re-examined with modern tools. And when the results return, the room goes still, because the DNA profile doesn't belong to the missing woman, and it doesn't belong to any officer or known visitor, but it does match the suspect, conclusively, irrefutably, a direct line drawn across 30 years of denial. The significance is immediate and limited at the same time, because presence does not equal guilt, but it shatters the suspect's narrative of casual acquaintance. It places him in the apartment during a window he swore he wasn't there, and the prosecutor leans forward now, interest sharpened, because this is the kind of evidence juries understand, the kind that doesn't require imagination to interpret. The suspect is arrested quietly, without spectacle, hands cuffed in a parking lot outside his workplace, co-workers watching through tinted windows, confusion blooming into rumor before the cruiser even pulls away, and the community absorbs the shock in stages, disbelief first, then a sickening recognition, because he was familiar, because he was ordinary, because evil that hides in plain sight feels like a personal indictment. Interrogation resumes in a room designed to remove distractions, and this time the suspect doesn't ask questions, he listens, his attorney beside him, as the detective lays out the timeline, the motel, the receipt, the fibers, the witness statements, the DNA, each piece placed carefully, deliberately, not as accusation but as inevitability, and she watches his face as the narrative tightens, watches the mask strain under the weight of coherence. He doesn't confess, not then, not fully, but he shifts, conceding small truths he can no longer defend against, admits he knew her better than he said, admits he was there that night, admits he offered her a ride, frames it as kindness, as coincidence, as misunderstanding, and the detective lets him talk because partial admissions are doors cracked open, because sometimes truth leaks out not as a flood, but as condensation. He stops short of violence, insists she left the car willingly, insists there was an argument but no harm, insists he doesn't know what happened after, a story riddled with convenient amnesia, and the attorney ends the interview before it can unravel further. But the damage is done, because the case now is shape, motive emerging from proximity, opportunity hardened into fact. Charges are filed cautiously, kidnapping first, because absence can be prosecuted even without remains, and the courtroom becomes the new battleground, where evidence must transform into persuasion, and as the judge reads the charges, the family hears the word accountable for the first time in 3 decades, and it lands with both relief and terror, because accountability promises answers but doesn't guarantee peace. The suspect is held without bail, the risk too high, the past too fluid, and as he sits in a cell designed to strip away control, something inside him shifts again. The confidence that time would protect him eroding rapidly, because time has done the opposite. It has preserved the evidence just long enough for technology and persistence to catch up. Outside, the story accelerates. Public interest surging, cold case units across the state watching closely, because this case threatens to redefine what resolution looks like when a body never appears, when proof must be built from absence, and the detective feels the weight of precedent pressing in, because whatever happens next will echo beyond this room, beyond this woman, into every unresolved file still waiting on a shelf. And as the trial date looms, as strategies harden and narratives compete, one question hangs over everything, unspoken but omnipresent: whether the truth that finally emerges will be enough, whether justice, without recovery, can satisfy a wound this old, or whether some mysteries, once opened, refuse to close cleanly, leaving behind not closure but a sharper, more permanent kind of knowing. The courtroom doesn't feel like a place of answers. It feels like a holding chamber for competing versions of the same night, air-conditioned, fluorescent, stripped of emotion by design, and yet emotion seeps in anyway, through clenched jaws, through the way the victim's family sits perfectly still as if movement might disturb something fragile, and through the defendant's posture, measured, contained. A man who has spent decades mastering the art of appearing unremarkable now facing a room, trained to notice every detail. The prosecution begins carefully, not with accusation but with absence. A woman who left her apartment one night and never returned, a calendar frozen mid-month, a life interrupted without explanation, and they let the silence do some of the work, because silence is the one thing everyone in the room already understands. It's what this case has been made of for 30 years, and now it has finally been given a microphone. They introduce the timeline piece by piece, resisting the temptation to dramatize, because the facts are dramatic enough when allowed to breathe. The last confirmed sighting, the unanswered calls, the abandoned car, the early assumptions that slowed everything down, and then the pivot, the routine traffic stop that reanimated a file long presumed inert, the moment when chance collided with persistence and produced momentum. The defense responds with restraint, emphasizing what isn't there: no body, no confirmed crime scene, no eyewitness to violence, framing the case as an exercise in inference rather than proof. And for a moment the balance feels precarious, because juries are trained to doubt, and doubt is fertile ground in cases built on absence, and the detective watches from the gallery, aware of how easily decades of work could dissolve under the wrong interpretation. Witnesses take the stand, their voices older now, less certain, but their stories align in ways they didn't before, patterns emerging not from precision but from consistency: a car idling, a door closing, a man seen where he claimed not to be, and the defense cross-examines aggressively, probing memory, exploiting time, suggesting contamination, but the witnesses hold, not because they remember everything, but because they remember enough. The motel receipt is entered into evidence, its faded ink projected large on a screen, the alias circled, the date underlined, and the jury watches as the prosecutor traces a line on a map from the apartment to the motel, from the motel to the highway, a path that feels intentional now, purposeful, and the defense objects on relevance, but the judge allows it, because relevance has grown over time, strengthened by accumulation. Then comes the DNA, delivered without flourish, a forensic analyst explaining degradation, probability, exclusion, the science stripped of mystery, and when the analyst states that the profile on the cigarette butt matches the defendant, the room shifts audibly, a collective inhale, because science cuts through speculation cleanly, and the defense's attempt to contextualize it as innocent presence lands thin, strained by the defendant's own prior denials. The defendant takes the stand against his attorney's advice, a calculated risk born of necessity, and he speaks calmly, carefully, revising his story just enough to accommodate the evidence without surrendering to it, admits proximity, admits acquaintance, insists on consent, insists on departure, insists on ignorance, and for a while his composure holds until the prosecutor asks about the jewelry. The question is simple, almost casual, and the object is displayed, small, intimate, unmistakable, Identified by the family through tears they refuse to wipe away, and the defendant hesitates, a fraction too long, before offering an explanation that collapses under its own weight, a gift returned, a misunderstanding, a coincidence that now feels grotesque in its improbability, and the jury notices, because juries are exquisitely sensitive to moments where narrative falters. Cross-examination tightens the screws, contradictions stacked carefully, methodically, not to humiliate but to exhaust, and the defendant's voice changes, just slightly, losing its practiced neutrality, revealing irritation, then defensiveness, then something closer to resentment, and in that progression the prosecution finds motive, not passion but entitlement, not rage but control, the kind that doesn't need to shout to dominate. Outside the courtroom, the community fractures along familiar lines, those who can't reconcile the man they knew with the man described on the stand, those who always felt something was off but never said it, and those who have learned the hard way that normalcy is not evidence of innocence, and the media feeds on the tension, headlines sharpening, speculation swelling, the phrase Florida cold case now synonymous with reckoning. Inside, closing arguments approach, and both sides understand the stakes, because this trial is not just about guilt, it's about whether time can be prosecuted, whether absence can be argued into certainty, whether justice delayed can still be justice, and as the judge instructs the jury, the detective feels the weight of every unanswered question pressing in, because even a conviction will not return what was lost, will not explain every silence. The jury deliberates longer than anyone expects, hours stretching into days, tension calcifying into ritual, the family waiting in a quiet room that smells like old coffee and fear, rehearsing grief for both possible outcomes, and when the verdict finally arrives, it does so without drama. A folded piece of paper passed forward, the courtroom rising as one, breath held collectively. The foreperson speaks, the words measured, deliberate, and the defendant's face registers the shift before the words land fully, because verdicts have weight, they move air, they alter gravity, and as accountability finally attaches itself to a night in 1995, the room exhales unevenly, relief and sorrow braided together, because resolution, when it comes this late, is never clean. Sentencing is scheduled for later, but the impact is immediate. A man taken away in custody, a family embraced by strangers who don't know what to say, a detective standing alone for a moment, absorbing the reality that a case once defined by emptiness has finally been given an ending, or at least something that resembles one, even as the absence at its center remains unresolved, a question that no verdict can fully answer. Sentencing day arrives without ceremony, because the justice system does not believe in catharsis, it believes in procedure, and yet the air inside the courtroom is heavier than it has been at any point in the trial, thick with the knowledge that this will be the last time the victim's name is spoken with formal authority, the last chance for language to impose meaning on a disappearance that resisted it for 30 years. The defendant stands again, older now than he was when the case reopened, visibly diminished by months of scrutiny and confinement, and the judge reviews the facts with a voice trained to remain neutral, outlining not just what was proven, but what was implied, what was inferred, what was constructed from fragments that survived time, and the sentence reflects that tension, severe but measured, punishment calibrated to certainty, restraint imposed where doubt still breathes. The family is invited to speak, and when they do, their words are not explosive, they are controlled, almost clinical, because grief this old has learned how to conserve energy, how to choose precision over volume, and they speak of birthdays missed, of holidays rearranged around an empty chair, of hope that never died but never healed either, and the courtroom listens, not out of obligation but because endurance commands attention. The defendant declines to speak, his attorney having advised silence, and that silence lands louder than any apology could have, because it confirms what the family has already learned, that answers are not something he intends to give freely, that control remains his last currency, even now, and as he is led away, the door closing behind him sounds final in a way nothing else in the case ever has. Outside the courthouse, microphones appear, questions collide, and the detective offers nothing beyond confirmation, because the story has already been told, and anything added now would risk distortion, and she watches the family navigate the sudden interest with careful detachment, knowing how quickly public attention fades once the word resolved enters the narrative. But resolution is a fragile term, and inside the cold case unit, the work continues, because a conviction without recovery leaves too much unanswered, and unanswered questions have a way of haunting the living. So searches are renewed quietly, targeted now by the defendant's partial admissions, by locations mentioned and then withdrawn, by routes traveled, by places that made sense only in retrospect. They search wooded areas near the old motel, dredge retention ponds, revisit construction sites long since paved over, guided by maps that have changed but not enough to erase what once was, and each search ends the same way, methodical, thorough, inconclusive, because Florida is a place that consumes evidence efficiently, heat and water working together to erase what humans leave behind. The detective reviews the defendant's prison calls, permitted, recorded, filtered for relevance, listening not for confession but for slippage, moments where language loosens under familiarity, where guarded phrases give way to implication, and she hears frustration, bitterness, self-pity, but no remorse, no revelation. And she begins to understand that whatever happened in 1995 is something he has rehearsed into a shape he can live with, a version that protects him even now. Time passes again, differently this time, not stagnant but heavy, and the case is moved to a different shelf once more, not cold, not active, something in between, a solved disappearance without a recovered body, a file that refuses to close completely, and the detective feels an unfamiliar unease, because she has achieved accountability but not clarity, justice but not truth, and those are not the same thing. Years into the sentence, a letter arrives, handwritten, cautious, from the defendant, requesting a meeting, offering information in exchange for unspecified considerations, and the detective reads it twice, feeling the old tension resurface, because offers like this are rarely clean, rarely complete, but they are often the only cracks left in a story built on control. The meeting is arranged under strict conditions, recorded, supervised, and when the defendant speaks, his voice is softer now, worn down by routine and regret that he still refuses to name directly, and he talks around the night, circling it, framing it as misunderstanding, as escalation gone wrong, as something he never intended to carry for the rest of his life, and then he offers a location, vague but deliberate, a place that feels chosen rather than remembered. Search teams return to the field once more, guided by coordinates that don't quite align with maps, by landmarks that have shifted or vanished, and they search because hope, even disciplined hope, demands action, but the land gives nothing back, and the defendant's credibility collapses with each empty grid square, reinforcing the suspicion that the offer was never about truth, but about leverage. The detective closes that door carefully, filing the interaction away, noting the inconsistencies, the timing, the absence of corroboration, and she feels something settle inside her, an acceptance she resisted before, that some cases resolve only partially, that some truths remain buried not because they are inaccessible, but because the person who holds them refuses to release them. The community moves on again, slower this time, changed by the knowledge that justice can arrive late but not gently, that danger can wear familiar faces, and the victim's name becomes a reference point, invoked in discussions about cold cases, about persistence, about the quiet power of chance, a reminder that disappearance does not equal erasure. And as the detective prepares to retire, clearing her desk, boxing up years of unresolved questions, she pauses over this file one last time, aware that it will follow her in ways paperwork never could, because it taught her something no training manual ever mentioned, that solving a case is not the same as understanding it, and that sometimes the most haunting part of a mystery is not what happened, but what will never be said out loud. Years slide by with the quiet persistence of erosion, not dramatic, not merciful, and the case settles into public memory as something finished, something labeled and shelved by headlines that prefer clean endings, but inside the family's home nothing feels finished, because closure is a word invented by people who get to walk away, and every anniversary reopens the same internal negotiation between remembering and surviving. The victim's mother keeps the room exactly as it was, not out of denial but out of discipline, because changing it would feel like agreeing to an ending she never witnessed, and the clothes still smell faintly of a life interrupted, a sensory proof that absence does not erase presence. And when reporters stop calling, when public sympathy moves on to newer tragedies, the silence returns. Heavier now because it follows resolution without recovery. In prison, the defendant adapts quickly, as men who value control often do, learning routines, learning faces, learning how to exist inside rigid structures where choices are limited but predictable, and he becomes unremarkable again, just another inmate with a long sentence and a history no one asks about twice. And that ordinariness is its own kind of shield, protecting him from scrutiny even now. Psychologists evaluate him as part of standard intake, noting emotional detachment, a preference for intellectualization over effect, an ability to describe events without inhabiting them, and they write reports that use careful language to describe something that feels hollow, a man who understands consequences but not responsibility, who regrets disruption but not harm. And those reports will never be read by the people who need them most. Occasionally, letters arrive at the cold case unit, not from the defendant but from strangers, amateur sleuths drawn in by documentaries and podcasts that dissect the case with fresh voices and recycled facts, offering theories, tips, locations already searched, and the detective, now retired but still consulted, reads them with patience because even misguided attention keeps a case alive, keeps it from dissolving into trivia. One letter stands out, not for its theory but for its tone, written by someone who lived near the motel in the 90s, someone who never spoke to police because no one asked the right question at the right time, and now memory has softened fear enough to allow language, and the letter describes a smell, unusual, persistent, coming from a drainage area behind the property weeks after the disappearance, a detail that never made it into any official report. The area is revisited, reluctantly because the odds are low and the cost is high, but the ground is changed, excavated, developed, reshaped by decades of construction, and the search yields nothing but debris, modern and inert. Yet the act of searching matters, because it reasserts the victim's claim to space, to attention, to the present, even when the past refuses to cooperate. The case becomes a reference in training seminars, cited as proof that patience matters, that databases remember what people forget, that routine interactions can carry extraordinary consequences, and recruits nod, absorbing the lesson abstractly, unaware of the human cost that underwrites it, because institutional memory is efficient but impersonal, and stories lose texture when they become examples. The family is invited to speak at one such seminar, and the sister accepts, standing in front of a room full of uniforms and explaining what it means to live inside an unanswered question, how justice without recovery is like punctuation without a sentence, technically complete but emotionally unresolved, and the room listens differently now because hearing loss described by those who carry it changes the weight of instruction. In private moments, the sister rereads old correspondence, early police letters heavy with optimism, later ones cautious, formal, distant, and she traces the evolution of tone as if it were a second investigation, one that charts how systems harden over time, how urgency gives way to process, and how families learn to navigate bureaucracy with the same persistence detectives bring to evidence. The defendant writes again from prison, less guarded this time, speaking in hypotheticals, framing memory as unreliable, suggesting the possibility of accident, of panic, of a decision made in seconds that reverberated for decades, and the letter is maddening in its proximity to confession without crossing the line, a performance of vulnerability designed to provoke engagement without surrender. The detective advises against responding because engagement is leverage, and leverage is what he wants, and the family agrees reluctantly because every word from him feels like oxygen to a fire they've spent years trying to starve. But silence carries its own cost because unanswered letters echo in the mind longer than read ones. Public interest spikes briefly when a streaming series revisits the case, reconstructing timelines with moody lighting and ominous narration, and the story is retold with new emphasis, new speculation, new language, and while some details are distorted, the core remains intact. A woman vanished, a suspect found decades later, justice partial and delayed, and viewers argue online about guilt and innocence as if certainty were a matter of preference. The family avoids the episodes at first, then watches them together one evening, not for clarity but for recognition, and they notice what's missing, the small kindnesses, the waiting, the years spent between headlines, and they realize that no retelling can capture the full weight of living inside a cold case, because the true story is not what happened in 1995, but what never stopped happening afterward. As another anniversary approaches, a memorial is planned, modest, intentional, not a grave but a gathering, a place to speak her name aloud without qualifiers, without legal language attached, and the community attends, older now, quieter, aware that time does not dilute loss, it only redistributes it. And as candles flicker and voices lower, the case breathes again, not as evidence or precedent, but as memory, unresolved, persistent, refusing to collapse into conclusion, reminding everyone present that even when the law finishes speaking, some stories continue, unresolved not because they lack answers, but because the answers they deserve were taken away. The memorial fades back into ordinary days the way all rituals do, folding grief neatly so life can continue around it, but something subtle has shifted, because speaking her name out loud again loosens memories that had been sealed for survival, and in the weeks that follow, small things begin to surface, not revelations, not confessions, just fragments shaken loose by permission. An old coworker reaches out, someone who shared late shifts and shallow jokes in the 90s, and admits there's a man who used to wait sometimes after closing, leaning against a car, watching without pretending not to, a detail dismissed back then as harmless persistence, flirtation misread through a kinder lens, and the sister writes it down anyway, because details don't expire just because they arrived late. A former bartender remembers an argument overheard weeks before the disappearance, not violent, not loud, just sharp enough to register, a woman insisting on being left alone, a man insisting he was being misunderstood, and the bartender remembers it now because the defendant's voice in the documentary matched the cadence of that memory too closely to ignore. A resonance that feels less like coincidence and more like recognition. These accounts are passed quietly to investigators, logged with appropriate caution, because corroboration after decades is fragile, but patterns don't require precision to matter. They require alignment, and slowly a clearer emotional landscape of 1995 emerges, a context of unwanted attention, of boundaries tested repeatedly until resistance became exhausting. In prison, the defendant watches the series too, or at least hears about it, because news travels efficiently inside confined spaces, and something about public narrative unsettles him. Not the accusation, but the loss of authorship, because for decades he controlled the story by withholding it, and now others are telling versions without his consent, filling silence with speculation, and control erodes not just through force but through irrelevance. He requests another meeting, this time without conditions, and the request is denied, not out of spite but strategy, because investigators have learned that engagement feeds performance, and performance is all he is left, and that refusal lands harder than interrogation ever did, because it tells him his story no longer matters unless it produces truth. The sister begins sorting through old boxes, not for evidence but for continuity, letters, photographs, school notebooks, marginalia of a life that existed beyond its ending, and she finds a journal entry dated just days before the disappearance, not ominous, not prophetic, just tired. A note about wanting quiet, about being watched too closely, about planning to say no more firmly next time. And the words hit harder than any testimony, because they speak without agenda. The journal is shared with investigators, not as proof but as context, and it deepens understanding even if it can't change outcomes, because motive doesn't require violence to be real. It requires imbalance, and imbalance permeates the story now with uncomfortable clarity. Another search is considered, debated, ultimately rejected because probability is thinned to a point where hope risks becoming harm, and the family accepts that decision with a discipline forged by decades of waiting, understanding that not all love needs a location to be valid. The case file is updated one final time, not with closure but with annotation, a recognition that truth has layers, some accessible, some sealed, and that the absence at the center is not emptiness but a presence too complex to resolve cleanly, and the file is archived with language that avoids the word solved, because solved implies completion, and this story resists that framing. In academic circles, the case is discussed as an example of narrative justice versus factual certainty, of how law fills gaps with reason while families live inside them, and students debate hypotheticals without realizing they are tracing the outline of a real woman's life, one that extended far beyond the question of how it ended. The sister returns to the apartment complex one afternoon, now unrecognizable, taller buildings, brighter lights, improved security, and she stands where the parking lot once met shadow, imagining a younger version of herself waiting by the phone, not yet afraid, not yet resigned, and she understands something quietly transformative, that the place no longer holds power, that memory has detached itself from geography. Letters from strangers continue to arrive, some offering sympathy, some demanding answers no one can give, and the sister learns to read them selectively, to protect what remains tender, because carrying a cold case teaches you discernment, how to decide which questions deserve space and which must be set down. The defendant ages visibly, his hair thinning, his posture rounding, and with age comes a subtle loosening, comments made to cellmates, secondhand accounts of late-night admissions framed as dreams or hypotheticals, none admissible, all corrosive to the certainty he once relied on, and investigators log them not as evidence, but as indicators, signs that the internal pressure has not dissipated. As the years stack quietly, the case transforms again, no longer a hunt, no longer a trial, but a presence woven into multiple lives, shaping decisions, sharpening empathy, altering trajectories in ways impossible to quantify, and that transformation feels like its own kind of resolution, not because it answers the central question, but because it refuses to let the absence define the entirety of what remains. And in that refusal, the cold case breathes differently now, less like a wound and more like a scar, still visible, still sensitive, but no longer dictating every movement, a reminder that while some mysteries never yield their final truth, they can still teach, still warn, still insist that silence is never neutral, and that even unanswered stories exert a gravity that pulls the living toward vigilance, memory, and care. Time does what courts cannot. It strips performances down to their bones, and inside the prison the defendant's world contracts into routine, count times, meals, concrete repetition that leaves little room for narrative control, and with that contraction comes a change, subtle at first, then unmistakable, a loosening of the grip he once had on his own story. He stops writing to investigators, stops requesting meetings, and instead talks to no one in particular, words leaking out during card games, during walks, during nights when sleep won't arrive, framing the past as if it belongs to someone else, a younger man, a reckless version, and those who hear it don't always understand what they're hearing, but they feel the weight in it, the shape of something unfinished. Corrections officers note the shift, log behavioral changes as required, and one officer, newer, less burdened by the history, recognizes the name when it surfaces casually, recognizes it from training videos, from seminars about cold cases cracked by accident, and that recognition reframes what had sounded like rambling into something closer to confession adjacent, not enough to act on, but enough to disturb. The information reaches investigators indirectly, cautiously, because prison intelligence is a fragile currency, and when it does, it confirms what they already suspected, that the defendant's certainty is eroding not because of guilt alone, but because time has robbed him of the belief that silence equals safety, and that erosion is dangerous, because desperation invites mistakes. He files an appeal, thin, procedural, more symbolic than strategic, and it fails quickly, reinforcing the finality he has spent years resisting, and after that denial, his health begins to decline, stress manifesting physically, ailments accumulating, and mortality becomes less abstract, a pressure that makes the past feel closer, louder, harder to compartmentalize. He begins to speak in conditional language to medical staff, asking what happens to cases when people die, whether unresolved matters stay unresolved, whether information given late still matters, and those questions are noted because they reveal concern not for innocence but for legacy, a fear of being remembered only for what he refused to finish. Meanwhile, the family's lives continue in quieter ways, Milestones reached with a careful awareness of who isn't there, weddings where a photograph occupies a chair, children named with intention, continuity asserted gently, and over time the absence becomes integrated rather than acute, still painful, but no longer disorienting. The sister is invited to consult on policy discussions about missing persons, lending her experience to structural change, advocating for early evidence preservation, for better cross-jurisdictional data sharing, and she speaks not as an expert, but as a witness to systemic delay, her voice steady, persuasive precisely because it carries no illusion of certainty. At one such meeting, an investigator asks a question that lingers, whether knowing the exact location would change anything now, and the sister answers honestly that it wouldn't change the past, but it would change the future, because burial matters, because ritual matters, because unanswered questions echo louder than painful answers. The defendant suffers a medical emergency, survives it, but the scare accelerates everything because proximity to death clarifies priorities in ways philosophy never can, and weeks later, a request comes through official channels, formal this time, unambiguous. He wants to talk, no conditions, no exchanges, just to be heard. The detective, long retired but still tethered to the case, is consulted, and she advises caution but not refusal, because timing like this is rarely accidental, and when the meeting is arranged, the room feels different from previous encounters, less adversarial, more brittle, as if the air itself might crack under pressure. He speaks slowly, unevenly, recounting the night not as justification but as sequence, the meeting, the argument, the decision to drive, the realization too late that he had crossed a line he couldn't retreat from, and he stops short again at the crucial moment, not naming it directly, but describing aftermath, panic, cleanup, concealment, language that circles truth like a vulture. When asked about location, his answers fragment, memory failing or resisting, landmarks blurred, distances approximate, and investigators note everything because even imprecision can narrow fields, but the frustration is palpable because the core remains just out of reach, guarded by either fear or self-preservation or both. The meeting ends without the clarity it promised, and disappointment settles heavily, but not as defeat, because something has shifted irreversibly. The defendant has acknowledged permanence, acknowledged responsibility without confession, and that acknowledgement, while unsatisfying, reshapes the moral landscape of the case. Publicly, nothing changes, no press release, no update, because partial truths do not travel well, and the family is informed privately, absorbing the information with a practiced steadiness, because they have learned to measure progress not by announcements, but by alignment, by whether the story makes more sense today than it did yesterday. As winter approaches, the defendant's health worsens again, and with it the urgency returns, and investigators prepare quietly, mapping potential sites from his fragmented descriptions, knowing that time, once an enemy, has now become an ally, because pressure no longer flows in his favor. And hanging over everything is the unspoken understanding that the next conversation may be the last, that whatever remains unsaid soon may never be said at all, and that truth, like evidence, degrades with time, not disappearing all at once, but thinning, fading, until what remains is an outline that must be interpreted carefully, compassionately, because even fragments carry weight when they are all that's left. The next meeting happens in a room designed for endings, not conclusions, smaller than the others, quieter, with a clock that sounds louder than it should, and the defendant is wheeled in instead of walking, the body finally betraying the mind that once believed it could outlast consequence, and the shift in power is unmistakable, because control is difficult to maintain when breath itself requires attention. He looks older than his years now, not just aged but eroded, edges softened by pain and medication, and when he speaks there is no preamble, no framing, no attempt to negotiate narrative advantage, only a halting urgency, as if he understands that time has become a finite resource he can no longer hoard. He says her name out loud for the first time, not as a symbol, not as a legal reference, but as a person, and the sound of it changes the room, because names carry gravity when spoken without armor, and he pauses afterward, gathering something fragile, maybe courage, maybe resignation. He talks about fear, not the abstract kind, but the specific terror of being seen as he was in that moment, exposed, ordinary, irreversible, and he admits that he did not plan for violence, that control slipped faster than he anticipated, that what followed was not rage but calculation, a decision tree collapsing into a single path that felt survivable at the time. When pressed for location, his eyes close, not theatrically, but in concentration, and he describes movement instead of place, turns instead of landmarks, the sound of water, the smell of rot and heat, an area that felt forgotten even then, chosen not because it was perfect, but because it was empty enough, and investigators trace his words onto maps in real time, triangulating probability from fragments. He breaks when asked why he never came forward, not with tears, but with anger, directed not outward but inward, at the version of himself who believed silence was strength, who mistook survival for absolution, and he says something close to truth, that once time passed a certain point, confession felt less like accountability and more like cruelty, reopening wounds he convinced himself were better left sealed. The detective listens without interruption because this is not an interrogation anymore, it is extraction, careful, deliberate, and when he falters, when details blur, she does not correct him because correction invites retreat, and retreat is the enemy of disclosure. He offers coordinates at last, imperfect but deliberate, anchored to a bridge that no longer exists, to a service road rerouted years ago, and he warns them that the land will not look the same, that Florida devours its own history efficiently, and the room absorbs that warning as both information and apology. The meeting ends abruptly when his strength fails, medical staff intervening, voices professional, urgent, and as he is taken away, the investigators exchange looks that contain no triumph, only resolve, because now action must replace listening, and hope must be tempered with realism. Search teams mobilize again, this time guided by narrowed probability rather than optimism, using ground-penetrating radar, archival maps, hydrology models that reconstruct what the land once was before development reshaped it, and they move quietly, deliberately, because spectacle would invite disappointment. Days stretch into weeks, grids marked and cleared, anomalies investigated and dismissed, until one morning a disturbance appears on the scanner that refuses easy explanation, a density inconsistent with surrounding soil, not definitive, but enough to stop the search and start excavation. The dig proceeds slowly, reverently, because this is no longer evidence gathering, it is recovery, and with each layer removed, anticipation tightens, fear shadowing hope, because discovery promises answers but also finality, and finality has its own cost. What they find is partial, fragmented, consistent with long-term exposure, and the forensic team works carefully, methodically, reconstructing identity from what remains, because even now, certainty matters, and when confirmation arrives, it does so quietly, a nod, a report, a sentence that ends a 30-year wait without fanfare. The family is informed privately, not by phone, but in person because some truths require presence, and when the words are spoken, there is no outburst, no collapse, just a long exhale, grief reorganizing itself around something solid at last, something that can be named and honored. The site is secured, documented, then returned to the world, because places do not keep secrets forever. They release them when conditions align, and as the search winds down, the case shifts again, not into celebration, not into closure, but into a quieter state where absence has been given form and uncertainty has finally narrowed into something survivable. The defendant does not live to see the recovery concluded, his body failing days later, death arriving without commentary, and that timing complicates nothing and resolves nothing, because truth does not require its author to remain alive, it only requires that it be found. And as the investigation prepares its final report, one truth stands clear above all others, that the coldest cases are not preserved by lack of evidence alone, but by the belief that time erases responsibility, a belief now dismantled piece by piece, by chance, by persistence, by the refusal to let silence have the last word. The final chapter of the case is not written in a courtroom, because there is no verdict left to reach, no sentence left to pronounce, and yet the system moves forward anyway, compelled by habit and duty, assembling timelines, closing loops, documenting every step, so that the truth exists not just as memory, but as record. Investigators compile the last report with unusual care, knowing this file will not be used to persuade a jury, but to withstand time, to answer future questions that have not yet been asked by journalists, by historians, by a generation that will wonder how something so violent could remain hidden for so long. They reconstruct the sequence minute by minute, separating what is known from what is inferred, marking uncertainty honestly, because this is no longer about winning, it is about accuracy, and accuracy is the only justice still available. The prosecutor issues a public statement, brief and restrained, confirming the resolution of the cold case, acknowledging the suspect's death, and emphasizing that responsibility does not dissolve with mortality, that facts remain facts regardless of who is alive to hear them. The media response is immediate but muted, headlines sharp but fleeting, because outrage has a shorter lifespan than grief, and the story competes with newer tragedies, louder scandals, fresher pain. Still, for a moment, the victim's name surfaces again, spoken on air, printed in ink, re-entering the public space from which it vanished decades earlier. For the family, resolution arrives in fragments, not as relief, but as reorientation, the long habit of uncertainty slowly giving way to something heavier but clearer, a grief with edges instead of fog. They planned a memorial not because the loss is new, but because it can finally be acknowledged openly, without the asterisk of missing, without the cruel hope of return. At the service, stories are shared that were once too painful to voice, details preserved like artifacts, her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she never finished coffee, and in those moments she exists fully again, not as a case number, not as evidence, but as a person reclaimed from abstraction. The detective attends quietly, standing at the back, not invited but welcomed, because some bonds form without language, and when she leaves, she does so knowing this will not be the last case she carries with her, only the one that taught her most clearly what patience costs. Years later, the cold case unit uses this investigation as training material, not as a triumph, but as a warning, an example of how easily cases freeze, how small assumptions compound into decades, and how progress often depends less on brilliance than on refusal, the refusal to accept that time alone should decide which lives matter. A student watching the presentation asks why the case was reopened after so many years, and the answer is unremarkable, almost disappointing, because someone noticed a detail that didn't fit and chose not to ignore it. That is how the story ends, without spectacle, without revenge, without the satisfaction fiction promises, but with something quieter and more durable, the restoration of truth, incomplete, imperfect, but real. Because in the end, cold cases are not solved when mysteries disappear, they are solved when silence does, when the unanswered is finally answered enough, and when the world is forced, however briefly, to remember someone it once forgot. Time moves on the way it always does after a case is labeled finished, indifferent, forward, carrying the solved and the unsolved together, erasing urgency while leaving consequences behind. The file is archived, the evidence sealed, the digital records backed up in redundant systems designed to outlast the people who created them, but the story itself does not stop moving, because stories like this never do. They settle instead into the quiet corners of institutions and minds, resurfacing when least expected, when a familiar pattern emerges, when a traffic stop feels heavier than it should, when an officer hesitates before letting a car disappear back into the dark. In the town where it began, the road where she was last seen becomes just another stretch of asphalt again, repaved, remarked, its past invisible to passing headlights. New businesses open, old ones close. Children grow up unaware that the ground beneath their tires once carried a question that haunted an entire community. And yet, there are still moments, late at night, when longtime residents lower their voices as they pass that place, as if sound itself might disturb something that never fully left. The detective retires years later, her badge turned in, her gun locked away, but she keeps a copy of the case timeline in a box at home, not out of obsession, but out of respect. She knows memory is fragile, that even solved cases can drift into myth if not anchored to facts, and she has seen too many stories simplified into slogans that erase the human cost. Sometimes she reads it again, not to relive the tension, but to remind herself why she stayed when it would have been easier to walk away. Across the country, a young patrol officer hears the story during training, presented not as legend, but as procedure, a reminder that routine is often where truth hides best. He listens closely when the instructor emphasizes the traffic stop, the small inconsistencies, the choice to ask one more question instead of ending the interaction. He does not know the victim personally, but her story reshapes how he understands his role, how power and responsibility intersect in moments that appear ordinary from the outside. Journalists revisit the case occasionally on anniversaries, in podcasts, in long-form articles that try to capture the emotional weight without exploiting it. Some succeed.
Some fail.
But each retelling reinforces a central idea that refuses to fade. That resolution does not erase harm, it only clarifies it. The past remains intact, even when its outline sharpens. The family moves forward in uneven steps, as all families do after loss, discovering that closure is not a door that closes, but a room you learn to live in. They mark birthdays again. They speak her name without flinching. They allow joy back into their lives without guilt. And still, sometimes, they wonder how different everything might have been if a single moment had unfolded another way, if one decision had been delayed, if one stranger had chosen not to look away. Years pass, and technology continues its quiet revolution. Databases grow smarter. Algorithms improve. New tools promise to prevent the next cold case from ever freezing. But every advancement carries the same silent warning. Tools are useless without attention, data meaningless without care. The case becomes a footnote in broader discussions about justice reform, about forgotten victims, about how systems fail not through malice, but through neglect. And then, gradually, the story recedes from public consciousness, replaced by newer tragedies, newer mysteries, newer names demanding remembrance. This is not cruelty. It is the rhythm of a world that cannot carry everything forever. What matters is that the truth was spoken when it could be, recorded when it mattered, and preserved for those who will one day ask how long silence can last before it breaks. In the end, the cold case does not end with applause or triumph. It ends with understanding, with a collective acknowledgement that justice is sometimes delayed, sometimes incomplete, but never irrelevant. It ends with the knowledge that even the quietest moments can echo across decades, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to hear them. And somewhere, on a road that looks like any other, a car passes through the night, unaware of the history beneath its wheels, unaware that a routine stop once cracked a mystery wide open, and that from that moment on, nothing about the ordinary ever looked quite the same again. Long after the final report is filed and the headlines fade, the case continues to exist in quieter forms, in procedural footnotes, in training manuals, in the muscle memory of officers who pause an extra second before closing a door or ending a stop. The mystery may be labeled resolved, but its gravity lingers, bending behavior, reshaping instinct, leaving a residue that cannot be measured in statistics. In court records, the suspect's name sits beside a stark notation, deceased. No cross-examination. No final words. Just an abrupt end to a life that carried a secret for decades. For some, this feels like an escape. For others, it feels irrelevant. Accountability, in this case, arrives not through punishment, but through exposure, through the permanent association of a name with an act that can no longer hide. History, unlike a jury, does not forget once it has told the truth. The victim's belongings, long stored in evidence lockers, are returned to the family in carefully labeled boxes. Objects that once seemed mundane now carry unbearable weight. A piece of jewelry, a notebook, clothing preserved by policy, not sentiment. Each item is a time capsule, untouched by the years that passed without her. They are handled slowly, deliberately, because rushing would feel like a second disappearance. The community reacts in fragments. Some feel vindicated, relieved that the unanswered question no longer hangs over local memory. Others feel anger, not just at the perpetrator, but at the years lost to silence, at the possibility that things might have been different if one detail had surfaced sooner. Conversations resurface in diners and barbershops, in places where stories are passed down orally, reshaped with each telling, growing sharper, darker, more symbolic than factual. A retired officer recognizes the case from decades earlier, remembers a briefing, a face, a hunch that never solidified into proof. He wonders privately whether he missed something, whether the truth brushed past him without stopping. There is no formal reckoning for this kind of doubt, only the personal audit that comes with age, the quiet tally of moments that might have mattered more than they seemed. The case is cited in academic journals analyzing investigative stagnation, illustrating how cold cases often freeze not because of complexity, but because of momentum, because once a narrative sets in, it resists disruption. Scholars dissect timelines, decision points, resource allocation, but even their most precise language cannot fully capture the human cost of delay, the years lived under a question mark. New detectives read the file with fresh eyes, unburdened by the original assumptions, and they are struck not by what is missing, but by what was always there. The truth did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. It waited. It required someone willing to see routine as a potential gateway instead of a conclusion. As seasons turn, the case becomes part of institutional memory, referenced without emotion, its lessons distilled into bullet points and protocols. And yet, beneath that professional polish, the story remains raw, a reminder that every unresolved case represents not just a failure to solve, but a life paused mid-sentence. In private moments, the family reflects on the strange duality of knowing and not knowing, of having answers that cannot change outcomes. They learn that certainty does not heal everything, but it does anchor grief, giving it a shape that can be carried instead of chased. The absence remains, but it no longer drifts. Years from now, someone will stumble across the case late at night, scrolling through archived articles, drawn in by the phrase cold case, by the promise of mystery. They will read until the end, expecting a twist, a confrontation, a cinematic payoff. What they will find instead is something quieter and more unsettling, the realization that resolution often comes too late to feel satisfying, and that justice, when delayed, leaves a shadow that stretches far beyond the moment it arrives. And so the story settles into its final form, not as entertainment, not as legend, but as a caution, etched into the collective record. A reminder that the ordinary can conceal the extraordinary, that silence can last for decades, and that sometimes, the smallest interruption, a routine stop, a second glance, a question asked instead of dismissed, is enough to crack a mystery that time itself could not erase. What remains after the aftermath is not closure but echo, the kind that repeats softly long after the sound that made it has vanished. The case seeps into places it does not announce itself, into policy meetings where language tightens, into late-night shifts where an officer feels the weight of every decision, into the quiet pause before a report is finalized and filed away. It teaches without preaching, warns without shouting, insists without asking permission. The records are audited one last time, cross-checked against new standards that did not exist when the investigation began. Boxes once sealed by dust are resealed by protocol, labeled with dates that span generations. A clerk initials a form without recognizing the name, unaware that those letters certify a story that once consumed entire lives. This is how institutions absorb tragedy, by converting pain into process, by translating chaos into order. The town council debates whether to install a small marker near the road, something discreet, something that acknowledges without reopening wounds. The proposal stalls. Not out of indifference, but fear. Fear that remembering will invite questions, that questions will invite blame, that blame will fracture a peace rebuilt over years of forgetting. In the end, nothing is placed there. The absence becomes its own statement. At night, the road still hums with traffic, engines rising and falling like breath. There are no ghosts in the cinematic sense, no apparitions stepping into headlights, but there is a feeling that lingers, a sense that the ordinary is thinner here, more fragile. Drivers slow without knowing why. Radios click off mid-song.
No one talks about it. No one has to.
In police academies, instructors emphasize discretion, restraint, attention. They tell recruits that the most dangerous assumption is that nothing is happening. They speak of routine as camouflage, of how evil prefers environments where no one expects it. The case becomes an example stripped of names, anonymized for teaching, but its core remains intact, a reminder that vigilance is not suspicion, and care is not paranoia. The family receives occasional letters from strangers, people who read the story years later and felt compelled to write. Some letters are clumsy, others deeply thoughtful. All of them acknowledge the same thing, that the victim mattered to someone who never met her. The family keeps a few, discards the rest, learning over time which gestures feel sincere and which feel like consumption dressed as concern. The detective, now removed from the daily noise of the job, notices how the case has changed her sense of time. She no longer measures years by calendars, but by intervals between answers, by how long it takes truth to surface when it is buried under habit. She understands now that patience is not passive, that waiting without watching is just neglect with better manners. As technology advances again, promising clarity where there was once blur, the case resurfaces briefly in discussions about predictive systems, about whether patterns can be detected before harm occurs. The irony is not lost on those who know the file well. Patterns were always there. What was missing was attention, the willingness to treat the ordinary as potentially significant. The echo grows quieter with each passing year, but it does not disappear. It folds into the background noise of a society learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to look at itself. It reminds those who listen that resolution is not an end point, but a ripple spreading outward, altering behavior in ways that are rarely traced back to their source. And somewhere, far from headlines and hearings, a person pauses at a green light, hesitates for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, scans the intersection, then proceeds. They do not know why they hesitated. They never will. But that pause, born from stories absorbed indirectly, invisibly, is part of the legacy of a case that refused to stay silent, even after it was finally named.